Smoke poured from the hood of a $250,000 Ferrari, twisting into the muggy August air. A man in a bespoke suit kicked the tire, cursing a dying engine on a deserted stretch of Route 9. Beside him, a beat-up station wagon rattled to a halt. A 7-year-old rolled down the manual window, pointing a sticky popsicle at the furious stranger. "My mum can fix it," he piped up. She couldn't, actually, but she was about to try. Sweat pooled at the base of Claire's neck, gluing her faded cotton shirt to the cracked vinyl seat of the '98 Lumina. The air conditioning had died 3 summers ago. Now the vents just pushed hot, dusty air around the cabin, smelling faintly of stale French fries and exhausted transmission fluid. In the rearview mirror, Toby was awake, his cheek pressed against the smudged glass. A half-melted cherry popsicle drooped dangerously from his fingers, a sticky red tear forming at the bottom of the wooden stick. "Don't let it drip on the seat, Tobe," Claire muttered, her voice raspy from the dry heat. "I won't," he said, though she could hear the distraction in his high-pitched voice. "Mum, look," Claire kept her eyes on the road. Route 9 was a barren ribbon of sun-bleached asphalt, cutting through a whole lot of nowhere. Nobody drove this way unless they were lost, broke, or hiding. Claire was currently batting 2 for 3. But then she saw it. Up ahead, simmering in the mirage-like heat waves rolling off the pavement, sat a car that had no business being in this county, let alone on this crumbling shoulder. It was a Ferrari. Low, wide, and painted a matte charcoal that seemed to absorb the aggressive afternoon sun. Right now, though, the engineering marvel was reduced to a very expensive paperweight. Thick, acrid grey smoke billowed from the rear engine compartment. Standing a few feet away was a man. He had his suit jacket off, hooked over one finger and slung over his shoulder. The white dress shirt underneath was clinging to his broad back. He wasn't on his phone, there was no cell service out here, and he wasn't pacing. He was just staring at the smoking machine with a quiet, terrifying stillness. Claire tapped the brakes, intending to slow down just enough to safely pass the hazard. She didn't stop for strangers. Not out here. Not with Toby in the back. But as the Lumina groaned past the Ferrari, Toby leaned his whole upper body out the window. "My mom can fix it!" he yelled, his voice slicing through the heavy, dead air. Claire slammed on the brakes. The Lumina shuddered, the anti-lock system grinding aggressively before the car lurched to a halt in the loose gravel. Dust plumed up around them, coating the rear windshield. "Toby, roll that window up!" she hissed, her heart kicking hard against her ribs. "But you can fix cars, Mum. He looks mad. People who drive cars like that don't want help from people who drive cars like this," she said grimly. She shifted into drive, ready to pull away. Then, a heavy knock hammered against her driver's side window. Claire flinched. She hadn't even heard him walk up. She turned her head. The man was standing right there. Up close, he didn't look like a frustrated rich guy. He looked like a predator, mildly inconvenienced by a trap. His eyes were a flat, unreadable hazel. His jaw was set with the kind of tension that broke teeth. He didn't ask her to roll down the window. He just stared at her until she did it. The handle squeaked as she cranked it down 3 inches. Just enough to hear him over the idling rumble of her own dying engine. "Your kid says you're a mechanic," the man said. His voice was low, smooth, and lacked any regional accent. It was the voice of a man who gave orders, not requests. "My kid says a lot of things," Claire replied, keeping her grip tight on the worn steering wheel. "I change oil and swap brake pads at a municipal garage. I don't touch imports, especially not ones that cost more than a city block." "I don't need a specialist," he said, glancing back at the Ferrari. The smoke was thinning, replaced by the distinct, nauseating smell of melted plastic and scorched rubber. I needed to move. I have somewhere to be. "Call a tow truck," she said. "No phones," he replied instantly, "and I'm not leaving the vehicle." Claire looked at him. Really looked at him. The expensive watch on his wrist, the subtle bulge under his left armpit that ruined the clean line of his tailored shirt. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a stranded businessman. This was a man whose stranded status was a liability to his survival. "Mum?" Toby asked from the back, oblivious to the sudden drop in temperature inside the sweltering car. "Are we helping?" The man's gaze shifted to the back seat. For a fraction of a second, the flat deadness in his eyes flickered. He looked back at Claire. 50 miles to the next town, he stated. It wasn't a question. "If you drive away, I'm stuck here until dark. I'd prefer not to be here when it gets dark." It was a warning wrapped in an observation. Claire chewed the inside of her cheek. If she left him, he was a problem for whoever found him next. If she helped him, he was her problem right now. But she had $20 in her checking account, and this man radiated the kind of wealth that solved immediate problems, even if it created long-term ones. She threw the Lumina into park. The transmission clunked heavily. "Lock the doors, Toby," she commanded. "Don't open them for anybody. I'm going to look at the engine." She stepped out into the crushing heat. The gravel crunched under her scuffed steel-toed boots. She walked past the man without looking at him, heading straight for the rear of the Ferrari. The heat radiating off the metal was intense. "Pop the hatch," she told him. He didn't move for a second. He wasn't used to taking directives. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black fob, and clicked it. The glass engine cover unlatched with a soft click. Claire lifted it. A wave of heat hit her face, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of burning wiring. "I'm Victor," the man said, stepping up beside her. He smelled heavily of cedarwood cologne and something sharper beneath it. Sweat and adrenaline. "Claire," she muttered, pulling a dirty rag from her back pocket to wipe grime from a hose so she could see clearly. "And Victor, you've got a massive problem." The engine bay of a Ferrari 488 is a tight, meticulously engineered space. Everything is covered in carbon fiber and heat shields, designed to look as good as it performs. Right now, it looked like a melted disaster. Claire leaned in, ignoring the way the hot metal bit through the thin fabric of her shirt where it brushed the quarter panel. She traced the source of the smell. It wasn't a blown head gasket or a cracked block. It was electrical. "You didn't hit any debris on the road, did you?" she asked, her voice muffled, as she peered deeper into the labyrinth of hoses and wires. "No," Victor said flatly. The power cut. The dash lit up like a slot machine, and then the smoke started. Claire reached down toward the lower left side of the engine block. Her knuckles, already scarred and permanently stained with old grease, brushed against a bundle of wires. The protective sheathing was completely gone. The wires themselves were fused together in a melted, blackened clump against the exhaust manifold. She pulled her hand back, wiping a smear of black soot onto her jeans. "You're lucky the fuel line didn't catch," she said, straightening up. She looked Victor in the eye. "Your main wiring harness melted onto the exhaust." Victor frowned, a subtle tightening of his brow. Why would it do that? "Italian engineering isn't perfect, but it doesn't spontaneously combust." "It doesn't," Claire agreed quietly. She looked around the empty highway. The wind rustled the dry scrub brush. Nothing else moved. Wiring harnesses are secured with heavy-duty mounting clips to keep them away from the heat. And mine broke. "No," Claire said, her voice dropping lower. She pointed into the engine bay. "Your clips didn't break. They're gone. And the heat shield that sits between the manifold and that wire bundle? It's been unbolted and removed." This wasn't an accident, Victor. Someone wanted this car to die, and they wanted it to look like a mechanical failure until it all burned up. Silence fell heavily between them. It was thicker than the humidity. Victor didn't gasp. He didn't look shocked. He just stared at the melted wires. The muscle in his jaw flexed once, violently. Then he looked at Claire. The terrifying stillness was back, but now it was directed at her. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Not who did this, not how is that possible. Just a cold, pragmatic pivot to the solution. "Are you kidding?" Claire let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I need a soldering iron, heat shrink tubing, replacement wires, and about 4 hours in a climate-controlled shop. I have a roll of electrical tape and some rusty wire strippers in my trunk. This car is bricked." "I am not staying on this road, Claire," Victor said softly. He stepped closer. The proximity was overwhelming. He was several inches taller, his physical presence dominating the space. If this was intentional, then whoever did it knows exactly where I'm going to break down. They know my route. They'll be coming. Claire's breath caught. She looked back at her Lumina. Toby was inside, playing with a plastic dinosaur on the dashboard, completely ignorant of the fact that they were currently standing on an execution ground. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. "Then you need to get in my car," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly. "We can drive you to the nearest station. You can use a landline." "If they are coming for me," Victor said, his eyes flicking to the station wagon. "They will shoot that piece of junk full of holes before you can hit 60. Your kid is in there. You do not want me in your car." He was right. The realization tasted like copper in her mouth. "Fix this," Victor ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I don't care how ugly it is. I don't care if it ruins the engine long term. Just get it to fire." Claire swallowed hard. She turned back to the engine. "Pop my trunk." She threw the keys at his chest. He caught them effortlessly. "Red metal toolbox. Bring it here." While he fetched the tools, Claire leaned back into the blistering heat of the engine. She had to separate the fused wires, strip them back to clean copper, and somehow bridge the gap without the wires immediately melting again when the engine ran. It was a butcher's job. Victor returned and dropped the heavy toolbox on the asphalt. It hit with a loud metallic clang. Claire dropped to her knees, popping the latch. She grabbed a utility knife, a roll of cheap black electrical tape, and a pair of pliers. "Hold this!" She shoved a small, battery-powered flashlight into his hand. "Shine it right where my hands are. Don't move." For the next 20 minutes, there was no sound except the scrape of metal on metal, the harsh tearing of electrical tape, and their synchronized, shallow breathing. Claire's hands were steady, entirely focused on the mechanical problem. She carved away the melted plastic, her fingers cramping as she twisted the raw copper wires together. She was acutely aware of Victor watching her. He wasn't watching the engine. He was watching her hands, the deep cracks in her knuckles, the short, unpolished nails. "You work fast," he murmured. "Fear is a great motivator," she shot back, biting off a piece of electrical tape and wrapping it aggressively around the exposed splice. "I'm tying these up with a zip tie to the chassis frame. It's going to hold them away from the exhaust, but the heat will eventually melt the zip tie. You have maybe 30 miles before this whole thing shorts out again. Do not turn on the AC, the radio, or anything that draws extra power." She pulled her hands back. They were completely black with grease and soot. "Try it," she said, stepping away from the car. Victor slid into the driver's seat. The interior of the Ferrari was a stark contrast to the dust outside. Crimson leather, carbon fiber accents, the smell of expensive conditioning oil. He didn't put his seatbelt on. He just pressed the bright red ignition button on the steering wheel. The engine hesitated. A painful, grinding whine echoed from the starter. Claire held her breath, her fingernails biting into her palms. Then, with a violent roar, the V8 engine caught. It idled rough, a slightly uneven mechanical growl, but it was running. Claire let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an hour. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a long streak of black grease across her pale skin. Victor stepped out, leaving the engine running. The smoke was gone. Only the normal heat distortion shimmered above the rear deck. He walked over to her. The tension that had coiled around him earlier hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. He wasn't looking at her like an obstacle anymore. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a leather money clip. It was thick, disgustingly thick. "What's your hourly rate?" he asked, peeling off $100 bill. "At the shop, it's 45, Claire said, her eyes fixed on the money. She hated how desperate she felt in that moment. Victor peeled off another 100, then another. He held out $500 in crisp, uncirculated bills. "I don't have change," Claire said stiffly, crossing her arms over her chest. She didn't want his money. It felt dangerous. It felt like an anchor tying her to whatever violent world he belonged to. "Take it," Victor said. He grabbed her hand. His grip was firm, his skin surprisingly calloused for a man in a bespoke suit, and pressed the money into her palm. "You saved my life today, Claire. 500 is an insult, but it's all the cash I carry." She looked down at the bills, then up at his face. The flat hazel eyes were intensely focused on hers. There was a dark, quiet calculation in them. He was cataloguing her face, memorizing it. "Don't stop until you hit the interstate," she told him, pulling her hand away and stuffing the cash into her front pocket. "And get a real mechanic to look at that wiring before your car burns to the ground." "I'll keep that in mind," Victor said. He didn't walk back to his car immediately. He glanced at the lumina. Toby was pressing his face against the glass again, watching them. "Drive safe, Claire," he said. It didn't sound like a light farewell. It sounded like an order to survive. He got back into the Ferrari, pulled the heavy door shut, and shifted into gear. The tires spun briefly on the loose gravel, kicking up a spray of rocks before the car shot forward onto the asphalt. In seconds, it was nothing but a shrinking red dot against the vast, empty horizon. Claire stood on the side of the highway, the heavy weight of the cash burning against her thigh. The silence of the desert rushed back in, broken only by the pathetic sputtering of her own car's exhaust. She walked back to the lumina and climbed in. The interior felt hotter than before. "Did you fix it, Mom?" Toby asked brightly as she threw the car into drive. "Yeah, Toby," Claire said, her voice hollow. She checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see black SUVs bearing down on them. Nothing but empty road. "I fixed it." She pulled onto the highway, driving in the opposite direction of the Ferrari. She tried to convince herself it was over. Just a bizarre roadside encounter. A story she would never tell anyone. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the cracked asphalt, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just fixed a stranger's car. She had inserted herself into a machine much bigger and far more dangerous than a broken Ferrari. And men like Victor didn't just walk away and forget who kept their engines running. Grease never really washes out. It just hides. It settles into the microscopic cracks of dry skin, staining cuticles and calluses a permanent, dirty grey. Claire scrubbed her hands with pumice soap over the slop sink, watching the abrasive foam circle the rusted drain. It had been exactly 6 days since Route 9. The $500 Victor gave her was already gone. It had evaporated into an overdue electric bill, a week of groceries, and a new pair of sneakers for Toby, whose toes had been bruising against the front of his old ones. The money was a ghost, leaving nothing behind but a lingering, paranoid chill in Claire's chest every time a dark car drove past her apartment. "Claire!" Gary, the shift manager at the municipal garage, yelled over the deafening, high-pitched whine of an air compressor. He was a thick-necked man who sweat through his uniform by 9 a.m. "Bay 3 is clear. Pull the cruiser in. Needs new rotors and pads." Claire wiped her raw hands on a blue shop towel and tossed it into the laundering bin. "On it," she called back. She walked out onto the main floor. The garage was a cavern of noise and exhaust fumes. It smelled heavily of brake cleaner, old oil, and damp concrete. She liked it here. It was predictable. Cars broke down for logical reasons. Friction, heat, time. You found the broken piece, you replaced it, the machine worked again. There was no malice in a worn-out brake pad. As she reached into her pocket for the keys to the cruiser, the ambient noise in the garage began to shift. The chaotic symphony of impact wrenches and shouting mechanics dialed back, one by one. The silence rippled inward from the open bay doors, heavy and unnatural. Claire turned around. A black Mercedes S-Class, polished to a menacing, mirror-like shine, idled silently just outside Bay 2. It sat far too low to the ground. Armored. The tinted windows were pitch black, reflecting the grim, fluorescent lighting of the city garage. It looked like a shark swimming into a wading pool. Gary dropped his clipboard. A couple of mechanics stood frozen by the tire balancer. The driver's side door opened with a heavy pressurized click. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He had on dark jeans and a black, long-sleeved Henley that clung to his shoulders, but the stillness was exactly the same. The flat hazel eyes scanned the garage, dismissing Gary, ignoring the mechanics, until they locked on to Claire. Victor. Claire's stomach bottomed out. The stale coffee she drank that morning turned acidic in her throat. She didn't move toward him. She held her ground by the hydraulic lift, her grip tightening on the heavy ring of keys in her hand until the metal bit into her palm. He didn't gesture for her to come over. He simply walked into the garage, his expensive boots silent on the oil-stained concrete. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The faint smell of cedarwood cologne cut through the heavy fumes of the garage, entirely out of place. "Your hourly rate is $45, Victor stated. His voice was low enough that Gary couldn't hear, perfectly calibrated to reach only her ears. "I'm on the clock, Victor," Claire said. Her voice shook, just a fraction. She hated herself for it. "I work for the city." "The city is done with you for the day," he replied smoothly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the metal workbench next to her. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "Buy out your shift. Bring your tools." "I don't do house calls." "This isn't a request, Claire." The flat deadness in his eyes flickered, replaced by something sharp and unyielding. "My primary mechanic is dead. The secondary is missing. I have a vehicle that needs an inspection, and you are the only person with grease on her hands who doesn't know the people I work with." Claire stared at him. "Dead." He said the word like he was reporting a flat tire. "I have a kid to pick up at 3, she whispered, her throat tight. "I have a man parked outside his elementary school right now," Victor said. Panic, hot and blinding, spiked behind Claire's eyes. She lunged forward, her hand flying up to shove him backward, but Victor caught her wrist before she even made contact. His grip was a vice of bone and muscle. He didn't twist her arm. He just held her firmly in place, stopping her momentum instantly. "He's watching the perimeter," Victor said softly, his face inches from hers. making sure nobody uses your son to get to me, or to you. He is perfectly safe. But you and I need to go to work. Now." He released her wrist. Claire stepped back, her chest heaving, her skin burning where his fingers had clamped down. She looked at the envelope on the bench. Then she looked at Gary, who was staring at his shoes, aggressively pretending not to see anything. No one was going to help her. She turned, grabbed her red metal toolbox, and walked toward the Mercedes. Cold concrete leached the warmth straight through the soles of Claire's boots. They were in a private, climate-controlled warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. There were no windows. The overhead LED lights were blindingly bright, casting harsh, clinical shadows across the floor. In the center of the vast, empty space sat a heavy-duty transport van. It was matte black, devoid of any license plates or identifying markers. "Check everything," Victor had said, leaning against a concrete pillar 20 feet away, his arms crossed. Claire lay on her back on a low-profile creeper, sliding beneath the van. The undercarriage was immaculate. No rust, no road grime. It made spotting anomalies easier. She clicked on her flashlight, holding it between her teeth as she traced the fuel lines with her fingers. She was terrified. Her heart was beating a frantic, a rhythmic tempo against her ribs, and her hands were slick with cold sweat. She wasn't an idiot. She knew what this van was used for. You didn't armor the floor pans of a cargo van with half-inch steel plating to deliver Amazon packages. "What exactly am I looking for?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly off the metal belly of the vehicle. "Anything that didn't come off an assembly line." Victor's voice floated back, calm and detached. "Trackers, remote detonators, spliced telemetry." Claire swallowed hard. She rolled herself further back, toward the rear axle. She checked the wheel wells. She checked the exhaust mounts. She checked the inner lip of the reinforced bumper. Nothing. She shifted her attention to the wiring harness running along the driver's side frame rail. She traced the thick, black, corrugated plastic, her fingers searching for brakes, for fresh electrical tape, for anything out of place. Right where the harness tucked up over the rear suspension block, her fingers brushed against something hard. It was small, the size of a matchbox, bound tightly to the wire bundle with high-tensile zip ties. Claire stopped breathing. The silence in the warehouse suddenly felt suffocating. She pulled the flashlight from her mouth and shined it into the dark crevice. It was a black plastic box. 2 tiny wires, one red, one black, were spliced cleanly into the van's power feed. A microscopic red LED pulsed steadily in the darkness. Every 3 seconds. Blink. It was a GPS tracker. Active. Claire's hands began to shake. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking. She dropped the flashlight. It hit her collarbone and bounced off the creeper, rolling away across the concrete floor with a loud, hollow clatter. She pushed her boots against the floor, scrambling backward to pull herself out from under the van. She bumped her forehead against the heavy steel frame, cursing, struggling to get clear. Victor was there when she emerged. He was already crouching, picking up her flashlight. He didn't ask what she found. He looked at her face, reading the raw, unfiltered panic in her wide eyes. "Where?" he asked. "Rear axle," Claire gasped, sitting up on the concrete, pulling her knees to her chest. She couldn't stop shivering. "Driver's side, tied into the main power line. It's blinking." Victor didn't flinch. He handed her the flashlight. "Get back under there and remove it." Claire stared at him, horrified. "Are you insane? I don't know what it is. It could be rigged. It could blow up." "It's a passive GPS transponder," Victor said, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. "If it were an explosive, it would be wired to the ignition relay or the fuel pump, not tucked over a suspension block where the blast would be absorbed by the frame. Clip the zip ties. Tape the spliced wires. Hand it to me. No. Claire shook her head aggressively, digging her heels into the floor, pushing herself further away from him. No, I'm done. I found it. You take it off. Victor stood up. The mild, patient demeanor vanished, replaced by the terrifying, cold predator Claire had met on the highway. He took one step toward her. The space between them evaporated. I do not pay you to point at problems, Claire, he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hairs on her arms stand up. I pay you to fix them. If I get under that van, my fingerprints are on a device that connects me to whoever put it there. Your fingerprints are already in the system from your municipal background check. They mean nothing to my enemies. You are invisible. Now get under the van. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was worse. It was absolute, crushing authority. It was the realization that he owned the situation, and by extension, he owned her in this moment. Claire's chest tightened until she felt dizzy. A tear of pure, frustrated terror leaked out of the corner of her eye, tracking warmly through the grease on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away with the back of her hand, smearing the soot. She hated him. She hated the suit, the cologne, the cold logic. Without a word, she grabbed her wire cutters from the floor. She lay back down on the creeper and shoved herself violently under the van. It took her 30 seconds. Snip! Snip! She taped the bare wires. She grabbed the little plastic box. It felt warm in her palm. The red light blinked merrily at her. She rolled out, stood up, and shoved the tracker hard into Victor's chest. He caught it effortlessly in one hand. Are we done? She asked, her voice cracking. For today, Victor said. He pulled a roll of cash from his pocket and held it out. Claire looked at the money, then at him. The internal contradiction tore at her. She was deeply, morally repulsed by this man and the violent orbit he lived in. But the municipal garage paid her $18 an hour. Toby needed braces. The rent was going up in August. She snatched the money from his hand. 3 nights later, Claire's burner phone rang. Victor had given it to her before she left the warehouse, a cheap plastic brick of a phone. Keep it charged, he had said. When it rings, you answer. It rang at 2 a.m. Claire was sitting in the warehouse 20 minutes later. She had left Toby asleep in her apartment, locking the deadbolt, the chain, and bracing a chair under the handle. It felt useless, but it was all she had. When she walked through the heavy steel side door of the warehouse, the smell hit her first. It wasn't oil. It wasn't brake cleaner. It was coppery, thick, and sweet. The smell of raw meat left out in the sun. It coated the inside of her nose and settled heavily in the back of her throat. Parked under the harsh LED lights was an Audi sedan. The rear driver's side window was completely gone, shattered into thousands of tiny, glittering cubes that littered the concrete floor. The door panel was dented inward, punched with deep, ragged holes, bullet holes. Victor was standing by a stainless steel utility sink in the corner, washing his hands. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. The water running down the drain was pink. The front left control arm is bent, and the steering rack feels compromised, Victor said, not looking at her. He reached for a paper towel, drying his hands methodically. I need to know if the frame is bent, or if it's just suspension damage. Claire didn't move. She couldn't. Her boots felt glued to the concrete. She stared at the shattered window. I said, I need a diagnostic on the steering rack, Victor repeated, turning off the faucet. He threw the paper towel away and turned to look at her. Claire forced herself to walk toward the car. Her legs felt like lead. As she approached the driver's side, the smell grew stronger. Nauseatingly strong, she leaned down to look at the front wheel. The rim was heavily scraped, the tire flat, but her eyes were drawn inexorably to the interior of the car. She couldn't stop herself. She looked through the shattered rear window. The pale grey leather of the back seat was soaked. A dark, tacky crimson pool spread across the upholstery, dripping down into the footwell where it soaked into the floor mats. A single bloody handprint was smeared aggressively across the inside of the opposite passenger window, frozen in a desperate downward drag. Claire's stomach violently revolted. She clamped a hand over her mouth, stumbling backward. She hit the edge of her rolling tool chest, spinning away from the car. She bent over, dry heaving, her chest spasming as her lungs fought for clean air. There was nothing in her stomach but water, but the biological imperative to purge the horror was overwhelming. She stood there, gripping the edge of the tool chest, coughing, gasping for breath, staring at the grey concrete floor. She waited for Victor to say something, to mock her, to tell her to pull it together, to threaten her. But there was only silence. Slowly, Claire straightened up. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. Victor was standing about 10 feet away. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't offered her water. He was just watching her. The flat, unreadable look was gone. Instead, there was a quiet, intense observation in his eyes. He looked at her not with pity, but with a strange, clinical fascination, like he was watching a species he didn't quite understand. "Someone died in there," Claire whispered, her voice fractured and hoarse. "Yes," Victor said. No hesitation. No softening of the truth. "You brought me here to fix a car that someone bled to death in." "I brought you here because the car is mechanically unsound, and I need it moved," Victor corrected quietly. "The interior is not your concern." "Not my concern?" Claire's voice pitched upward, cracking with hysterical disbelief. "There is a handprint on the window, Victor. This isn't a broken alternator. This is a crime scene. I'm an accomplice just by standing in this room." "You are already an accomplice, Claire," he said. The words fell like heavy stones in the quiet warehouse. "You were an accomplice the moment you rewired my Ferrari on Route 9. You just didn't realize it until now." Claire stared at him. The reality of her situation crashed down on her, suffocating and absolute. He wasn't holding her hostage. He didn't need to. He had slowly, methodically, tangled her into his world, using her own desperation as the rope. "I can't do this," she said, her voice dropping to a broken whisper. She looked down at her hands, the grease stained into her skin. "I can't." Victor walked toward her, closing the distance slowly. He stopped just out of arm's reach. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't try to comfort her. "You can," he said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. "You are smarter than the men who work for me. You are braver than the men who shoot at me, and you have a reason to survive that sits in a classroom every day at 9 a.m. He reached into his pocket and placed a thick stack of bills on the tool chest, right next to her hand. "Take a breath, Claire," he instructed. "Put on a pair of gloves, and tell me if the steering rack is broken." Claire looked at the money. It was covered in a thin paper band. $50 bills. Enough to move Toby out of the city. Enough to vanish. But she knew, staring at Victor's perfectly calm face, that she could never run far enough. She turned away from him, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled a pair of black nitrile gloves from the box on her cart. The latex snapped sharply against her wrists as she pulled them on. She walked back to the bloody Audi, dropping to her knees on the cold concrete to look at the suspension, trying desperately not to breathe through her nose. Rain hammered against the thin glass of Claire's apartment window, blurring the neon glow of the liquor store across the street into a smeared, radioactive red. Water seeped through the deteriorated weather stripping, pooling on the cheap laminate floor. She didn't wipe it up. She just watched the drops gather and swell, her mind thousands of miles away from the damp chill of her living room. 2 weeks had passed since the bloody Audi. Her freezer currently held $6,000 in vacuum-sealed plastic bags, tucked behind a crusty box of generic fish sticks. Every time she opened the door to get Toby a popsicle, the frozen bricks of cash mocked her. It was escape money. It was also a tether. You didn't walk away from a man who handed you that kind of cash just to diagnose a steering column. Tuesday morning at the municipal garage felt like breathing underwater. The humidity was suffocating, trapping the exhaust fumes and the sharp, chemical bite of degreaser beneath the corrugated tin roof. Claire was under a Ford Explorer, aggressively wrenching a rusted catalytic converter bolt when the heavy steel-toed boots stopped next to her creeper. They weren't Gary's scuffed work boots. These were polished black leather. Expensive. Shops closed to the public, Claire muttered around the small flashlight clamped in her teeth. "I'm not the public," a voice replied. It was raspy, like the speaker had swallowed glass at some point in his life. Claire let the socket wrench drop to her chest. She pulled the flashlight from her mouth and rolled herself out into the muggy garage air. The man standing over her was built like a cinder block. He wore a cheap grey suit that pulled tightly across his thick shoulders. His nose had been broken multiple times, healing in a jagged slope. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint gum and stale cigarette smoke. "Gary usually handles the walk-ins," Claire said, sitting up slowly. She kept her right hand resting casually near the heavy steel handle of her wrench. "Gary sent me to you," the man said, offering a smile that didn't reach his dead, reptilian eyes. "Said you were the best wrench in the building. Said you have a knack for the tricky stuff." "I fix city cars. Nothing tricky about a Crown Vic." "Sure," the man said. He crouched down, his knees popping audibly, bringing his face level with hers. "My name is Leo. I represent a party that is currently trying to locate a specific vehicle. A matte charcoal Ferrari 488. It had some electrical issues on Route 9 a few weeks back. Word is, a woman in a beat-up station wagon got it running." Claire's blood turned to ice water. The ambient noise of the garage, the pneumatic drills, the clanging metal, the shouting, faded into a dull, underwater hum. "I don't know anything about a Ferrari," she said. Her voice was steady. Decades of lying to debt collectors and bad landlords kicked in, flattening her tone into absolute boredom. "I commute on Route 9, so do 1,000 other people." Leo reached into his breast pocket. For a wild, terrified second, Claire braced to see gunmetal. Instead, he pulled out a folded photograph. He flipped it open and dropped it on her chest. It was a grainy, zoomed-in shot taken from a security camera at a gas station. It showed her faded 98 Lumina. The license plate was perfectly legible. "A lot of people commute," Leo agreed softly. "Not a lot of people pull into a Shell station 20 miles from a broken-down $250,000 car covered in fresh electrical soot, paying for gas with a crisp $100 bill." Claire looked at the photo, then up at Leo. The mechanical side of her brain, the part that diagnosed failures and calculated tension, began to whir. He didn't know everything. If he knew she was working for Victor directly, she'd already be in the trunk of a car. He was fishing. He had a license plate and a gas station receipt. He needed her to lead him the rest of the way. "I found a guy broken down," Claire lied smoothly, handing the photo back. "He offered me $100 to tape up some melted wires so he could limp it to a dealership. I taped them. I took the cash. I left. That's the whole story." Leo chewed his peppermint gum slowly. He leaned in closer. The smell was nauseating, The man driving that car owes my boss a great deal of money, Leo whispered. He's been hard to find lately. If you hear from him, if he needs his oil changed or his bullet holes patched, you call this number. He dropped a blank white card with a single phone number printed on it onto her lap. And Claire? Leo stood up, brushing dust from his cheap suit. He looked around the garage, then back down at her. I hear the local elementary schools let out at 3 o'clock. Traffic can be a nightmare. You should be careful on your drive. The threat wasn't veiled. It was a sledgehammer to her ribs. Claire watched him walk out of the bay doors, blending perfectly into the grey, overcast afternoon. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. A cold, absolute rage clamped down over her panic, compressing it into something hard and sharp. She stood up, grabbed her heavy red toolbox by the handle, and walked straight to Gary's office. She kicked the door shut behind her. Gary looked up from his clipboard, startled. "Hey, what's—" "I quit," Claire said. She didn't wait for his response. She walked out to her Lumina, threw the toolbox in the trunk, and slammed it shut. The metal clattered loudly in the empty lot. She pulled out her burner phone. It had been silent in her glove box for 2 weeks. She dialed the only number programmed into it. It rang twice. "Yes." Victor's voice was clipped, background noise muffled behind him. "A man named Leo just walked into my garage," Claire said, her voice shaking with raw adrenaline. "He has my license plate. He threatened my son. Whatever war you are fighting, it just spilled onto my driveway." Silence on the other end. For 3 long seconds, there was nothing but the faint static of the cellular connection. "Pick up, Toby," Victor finally said. The terrifying stillness was back in his voice. It wasn't panic. It was the sound of a machine calculating a lethal response. "Do not go back to your apartment. Drive to the lower levels of the parking garage at 4th and Mercer. Park facing the exit. Wait for me." The line went dead. Claire gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She was no longer a mechanic catching a lucky break. She was a liability. And in Victor's world, liabilities got erased. The concrete belly of the parking garage smelled of stale urine, damp earth, and old motor oil. It was entirely abandoned. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, several of them flickering violently, casting erratic, strobing shadows across the pillars. Claire sat in the driver's seat of the Lumina, the engine off. Toby was in the back, happily eating a bag of fast food French fries, oblivious to the fact that his mother was clutching a heavy steel tire iron in her lap. "Why are we waiting in the dark, Mum?" he asked around a mouthful of fries. "We're meeting a friend for a minute, Toby. Keep eating." Tires screeched on the concrete ramp above them, the harsh, heavy echo of a massive engine descending fast. Claire gripped the tire iron, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her sternum. A black SUV tore around the corner, its high beams blinding her. It didn't slow down gracefully. It slammed on the brakes, the anti-lock system stuttering loudly as it skidded to a halt mere feet from the Lumina's front bumper. The front grille of the SUV was dented inward. The driver's side headlight was shattered. The door opened. Victor practically fell out. He caught himself against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a black tactical jacket. But the left side was torn open and slick with something dark and heavy. He staggered forward, clutching his side, his breathing ragged and audible even over the idling engine of his vehicle. Claire threw her door open and ran to him. "Victor!" she gasped, catching his good arm as his knees buckled. Up close, the smell of copper and burnt ozone was overwhelming. He was heavy, a dense, muscular, dead weight that nearly dragged her down to the concrete. They moved faster than I anticipated," he gritted out, his teeth clenched in agony. His face, usually a mask of unreadable control, was pale and strained. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Leo is dead. But he wasn't alone. You're bleeding out, Claire said, panic sharp in her throat. She dragged him toward the Lumina, leaning his weight against the rear passenger door. I need to get you to a hospital. No hospitals, Victor snarled, his hand gripping her shoulder with bruising force. The police are on their payroll. The doctors will report the gunshot. You take me there, you might as well put a bullet in my head yourself. I am a mechanic, Victor. I fix cars. I don't know how to fix a human being. You know plumbing, he gasped, sliding down the side of her car until he was sitting on the cold concrete, leaning against the rear tire. You know pressure. Stop the leak. Toby's face appeared in the back window, his eyes wide, the half-eaten fry forgotten in his hand. He stared at the terrifying man bleeding against his mother's car. Victor looked up at the boy. The hard, predatory violence in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a strained, desperate calm. He forced his mouth into a rigid line, suppressing a groan of agony. He wouldn't terrify her kid. Even bleeding to death on a garage floor, he maintained that line. Toby, Claire said sharply, pointing at him through the glass. Put your headphones on. Watch your movie. Do not look out this window. Do you understand me? Toby nodded slowly, shrinking back into his seat and pulling his bright blue headphones over his ears. Claire dropped to her knees beside Victor. She unzipped his jacket. The bullet had torn through the side of his abdomen, just below the ribs. It wasn't a clean in and out. The fabric of his shirt was saturated, bubbling slightly with every shallow breath he took. It clipped your lung, she whispered, her hands hovering over the horrific wound. Sucking chest wound, Victor managed to say, his eyes fluttering shut for a second. Air is getting into the chest cavity, compressing the lung. You have to seal it, or I suffocate. Claire's mind raced. Diagnostics. The system is compromised. Outside air is entering a sealed vacuum line. The engine is drowning. Hold this! She grabbed his bloody hand and pressed it hard over the hole. Do not let go. She scrambled to the trunk of the Lumina, throwing it open. She bypassed the wrenches and sockets. She grabbed a roll of heavy-duty Gorilla Tape, a clean, unopened plastic sheet she used for covering upholstery, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. She ran back and dropped beside him. This is going to burn, she warned, unscrewing the cap of the alcohol. Victor didn't open his eyes. He just gave a single, tight nod. Claire pulled his hand away and dumped half the bottle directly into the ragged hole. Victor's entire body convulsed. A guttural, animalistic sound tore from his throat, but he didn't scream. His jaw locked so hard Claire thought she heard a tooth crack. She worked frantically. She cut a square of the thick plastic sheeting. She slapped it directly over the wound. Breathe all the way out, she ordered. Empty your lungs. Do it, Victor exhaled, a long, shuddering groan. As the air left him, Claire taped down 3 sides of the plastic square with the Gorilla Tape, leaving the bottom edge open. It's a one-way valve, she explained, her voice frantic, hands slick with his blood. When you breathe in, the plastic sucks against your skin and seals the hole. When you breathe out, the air trapped in your chest can escape out the bottom. It should reinflate the lung. Mostly. Victor took a ragged breath. The plastic square snapped flat against his bloody skin. He exhaled, and a wet bubble of air pushed out the bottom edge. He took another breath. It was deeper this time, less wheezing. He opened his eyes. The hazel irises were dilated, rimmed with pain, but the sharp, terrifying intelligence had returned. He looked down at the crude patch job, then up at her face. You're a brilliant mechanic, Claire, he whispered. Shut up, she snapped, wiping a bloody hand across her forehead, smearing crimson into her hairline. She was shaking violently now. The adrenaline was cresting, leaving a sick, hollow fear in its wake. We can't stay here. You said Leo wasn't alone. They know what I drive. My SUV has plates they don't know yet, Victor said, gesturing vaguely to the idling behemoth. We take that. But they will track my phone. They will track the car's telemetry. I can disable the GPS, Claire said immediately. No time. Victor struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the tape pulled his skin. They are close. If we run in the SUV, they will catch us before we clear the city limits. We need them to chase a ghost. Claire looked at her Lumina, the rusted panels, the dying transmission. It was a piece of junk, but it was hers. It was Toby's safety. You want to use my car as a decoy, she stated flatly. I need you to rig it, Victor said. He wasn't asking. He was trusting her to understand the mechanics of survival. Make it drive. Make it draw them away. Can you do it? Claire stared at him. This was the point of no return. Up until now, she was a civilian caught in the crossfire. If she did this, she was actively participating in a war. She was building a weapon. She looked at Toby, completely oblivious in the back seat, bobbing his head to whatever cartoon was playing on his screen. She didn't have a choice. You don't negotiate with the fire when the house is burning down. You just grab the axe. Get in your SUV, Claire ordered, her voice devoid of all emotion. Don't bleed on the steering wheel. Give me 3 minutes. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy cinder block from a pile of construction debris near the pillar. She hauled it to the driver's side of the Lumina. She popped the hood first. She didn't have time for elegant sabotage. She grabbed her heavy pliers and located the throttle cable linkage. She twisted it, bending the metal bracket so the throttle plate would stick wide open. The engine would rev to the red line the second it had fuel. She slammed the hood shut. Next, she opened the driver's side door. She reached under the steering column, ripped away the plastic housing, and exposed the ignition wires. She stripped the red battery wire and the starter wire, twisting them together. The dashboard lit up. She left the final connection, the ignition switch itself, bare. She climbed into the back seat. Toby looked up, pulling one headphone off. Hey, buddy, Claire said, forcing a terrifyingly bright smile. Change of plans. We're going to ride in the big black truck with Victor. Grab your backpack. Toby didn't argue. The tension in the air was too thick even for a 7-year-old to ignore. He grabbed his bag and scrambled out of the car. Claire ushered him quickly to the black SUV, opening the heavy armored rear door and buckling him in. Victor was slumped in the driver's seat, one hand clamped over the plastic valve on his side, the other gripping the steering wheel. He looked like a ghost. Move over, Claire said, opening his door. You can barely sit up. I'm driving. Victor didn't argue. He awkwardly hoisted his body over the center console, biting back a groan, and collapsed into the passenger seat. Claire ran back to the Lumina. The silence of the parking garage was suddenly shattered by the distant, high-pitched squeal of tires on concrete. They were coming down the ramp. She had seconds. She leaned into the Lumina. She threw this transmission into drive, keeping her foot firmly planted on the brake pedal. She reached under the dash and tapped the raw ignition wire against the bundle. The starter ground violently, and the engine roared to life. Because of the bent throttle bracket, the engine instantly screamed, revving to 5,000 RPMs. The entire car shuddered, pulling aggressively against the brakes. Claire grabbed the cinder block. With a heave, she dropped it directly onto the gas pedal. The engine hit the rev limiter, bouncing off it with a deafening metallic shriek. She threw herself out of the car, slamming the door shut just as she let off the brake. The Lumina launched forward like a missile, tires spinning, smoking heavily against the slick concrete. It tore across the empty garage, a roaring, driverless battering ram. Claire sprinted to the SUV and hurled herself into the driver's seat. She slammed the door, throwing the heavy vehicle into gear. In her rearview mirror, two dark sedans tore around the corner, headlights sweeping across the pillars. They saw the Lumina rocketing toward the far exit ramp, smoke billowing from its tires. "They're taking the bait," Victor breathed, his head resting against the cold window. The sedans didn't even look at the parked SUV in the shadows. They gunned their engines, swerving to chase the screaming station wagon as it careened wildly up the opposing ramp. Claire didn't wait to see the inevitable crash. She killed the SUV's headlights, slammed her foot on the accelerator, and shot toward the secondary exit on the lower level. The heavy, armored truck handled like a tank, absorbing the speed bumps without a shudder. They burst out of the parking garage into the rainy, neon-lit streets of the city. Claire kept the lights off until they were 3 blocks away, merging seamlessly into the heavy, slow-moving evening traffic. Her hands were locked onto the leather steering wheel, trembling so violently she thought she might snap the column. In the passenger seat, Victor was frighteningly quiet. His breathing was shallow, the plastic valve clicking softly against the duct tape with every exhale. "Where are we going?" Claire asked, her voice hollow. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her hollowed out, exhausted, and terrifyingly awake. "Safe house," Victor rasped. "North side, 44th and Elm. Below the old textile mill. There's a doctor waiting." Claire didn't ask how he arranged a doctor while bleeding out in a parking garage. She didn't want to know the mechanics of his empire. She just wanted this night to end. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the cabin. Toby had fallen asleep in the back, exhausted by the tension. "You broke your own car," Victor said suddenly. His voice was faint, but the intensity in it was undeniable. Claire kept her eyes on the wet road. It had a bad transmission anyway. "You sacrificed your only mobility to give me an exit," Victor continued, turning his head slightly to look at her. The streetlights washed rhythmically over his pale face. "You could have driven away, left me in the garage. And Leo's friends would have found my apartment by midnight," Claire said coldly. "Don't mistake self-preservation for loyalty, Victor." A low, wet chuckle vibrated in Victor's chest, instantly followed by a wince of pain. "I don't," he whispered. "Loyalty is bought. Self-preservation is instinct. I trust instinct a hell of a lot more." He reached across the wide center console. His hand, stained with dried blood and smelling of copper, covered her small, grease-stained fingers where they gripped the steering wheel. He didn't squeeze. He just rested his hand there. It was a heavy, undeniable claim. "You're in now, Claire," he said softly. The flat, dead tone was entirely gone. In its place was something darker, something possessing a terrifying gravity. "The city garage is gone. The beat-up cars are gone. You belong to my garage now." Claire didn't pull her hand away. She couldn't. The brutal truth was that she had crossed the line the moment she put her hands on the melted wires of his Ferrari. She had fixed a broken monster, and now the monster was her only shield against the dark. She looked at his bloody hand, covering hers. She looked at the road ahead, disappearing into the rainy night. "I don't do upholstery," she said, her voice deadpan, staring straight ahead. "And I don't clean up blood. You break the engines, I fix them. That's the deal." Victor smiled. It was a thin, painful expression, but it was genuine. "Deal," he whispered, closing his eyes as the armored SUV disappeared into the shadows of the industrial district. That concludes our story of Claire and Victor. When a desperate mechanic crosses paths with a ruthless underworld boss, survival becomes the ultimate negotiation. Did Claire make the right choice, trading her quiet life for the dangerous protection of a man like Victor? If you loved this gritty, slow-burn tension and want more deeply human, high-stakes audio dramas, you know what to do. Hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Share this video with your fellow dark romance fans, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below. Would you have fixed the Ferrari? See you next time.